Turkey has just taken a step that could end a 40-year insurgency and potentially redraw the political map of the region. Parliament voted 468 to 88 for legislation offering conditional legal relief to thousands of Kurdish militants, but there is a catch. The law only activates after Turkey verifies that the PKK has completely disarmed. If this succeeds, Turkey could close one of the Middle East's longest-running conflicts. If it fails, the country could return to the cycle of violence that destroyed previous peace efforts. And behind the peace process sits an even bigger question. Is this about ending the PKK conflict, or is President Recep Tayyip Erdogan also trying to reshape Turkey's politics and his own political future? The legislation contains 12 articles covering disarmament, rehabilitation, and legal procedures for PKK members. Some prison sentences would be suspended, while certain investigations and trials could pause for 5 or 10 years, depending on the alleged offense. If the individual commits no terror-related crime during that period, authorities would drop the case. But the bill excludes people convicted of intentional killings and those who received life sentences before 2005. That means Abdullah Ocalan, the PKK's imprisoned leader, does not qualify. The PKK has fought Turkey since 1984. The conflict has killed tens of thousands and spread into Iraq and Syria. Turkey, the United States, and the European Union classify the PKK as a terrorist organization. The current opening followed a call from Ocalan, who has spent more than 2 decades in prison. The PKK announced that it would dissolve itself and end its armed campaign. Fighters then staged a symbolic disarmament ceremony in northern Iraq and began withdrawing from positions in Turkey. That brings us to the first major revelation. Ankara is not offering peace before disarmament. It is offering legal rehabilitation as the reward for disarmament. First, the sequence matters. Turkey's National Security Council must confirm that the PKK has disbanded and surrendered its weapons. Only then will the new measures take effect. Eligible former militants will have 6 months to apply after the decision appears in the official gazette. This gives Ankara a powerful verification mechanism. For thousands of fighters, that could create a path away from the battlefield and toward civilian life or politics. But fighters need confidence that returning to Turkey will not simply lead to new arrests or prosecutions. The PKK-linked ANF outlet has already criticized the legislation as incomplete, demanding democratic reforms, Kurdish rights, and freedom for Ocalan. That means the peace process now depends on something harder than surrendering weapons, convincing both sides that the political system can absorb former enemies. And that leads to the second revelation. The most important battlefield may now be politics inside Turkey. The pro-Kurdish DEM party has supported the peace effort while demanding greater rights and a larger political role for Ocalan in the transition. For Erdogan, this creates a potentially important political opportunity. Turkey's constitution limits a president to 2 terms, but an early parliamentary election during his current term could potentially allow Erdogan to run again. Winning broader support from Kurdish voters and DEM could therefore become politically valuable. His opponents see exactly that possibility. The Nationalist Good Party has argued that the legislation could help Erdogan remain in power. This does not prove that Erdogan launched the peace process for electoral reasons. But the political calculation cannot be ignored. A successful peace process could transform Erdogan from the leader of a government that fought the PKK into the leader who finally ended the conflict. And if that happens, the consequences will extend well beyond Turkey's borders. The third revelation is that the agreement could reshape the relationship between Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. The PKK has operated across borders for decades, especially from bases in northern Iraq. Ending its armed campaign inside Turkey therefore requires more than a Turkish legal framework. It requires cooperation with Iraq and a reduction of the group's armed infrastructure outside Turkey. A successful settlement could strengthen Ankara's relationship with Baghdad, because both governments would have a shared interest in preventing Iraqi territory from becoming a base for renewed insurgency. Syria presents an even more complicated problem. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces control territory in northeastern Syria and maintain ties that Ankara associates with the PKK. Turkey wants to prevent a Kurdish armed structure from becoming a permanent security threat along its southern border. If the PKK truly dissolves, Ankara could use that development to pressure or negotiate with Kurdish forces in Syria over integration, disarmament, and political participation. But the risks remain enormous. Previous peace efforts collapsed, most recently in 2015. Trust remains extremely low. Nationalists inside Turkey oppose concessions, while Kurdish political actors argue that disarmament without democratic reform could leave their communities vulnerable. The Ocalan question could become the hardest issue of all. He remains imprisoned and excluded from the bill's legal benefits. DEM wants him to receive a formal role in coordinating the transition and ultimately seeks his release. Ankara has not accepted that demand. For the peace process to survive, Turkey must therefore solve two competing expectations. The state wants verifiable disarmament, while Kurdish actors want guarantees that political participation will replace armed struggle. The regional implications are significant. For Iraq, successful disarmament could reduce the PKK-related security burden in the north and open space for closer cooperation with Ankara. For Syria, it could accelerate pressure on Kurdish forces to integrate into the Syrian state. For the United States and Europe, the outcome also matters because both have long classified the PKK as a terrorist organization. But failure would carry the opposite message. If fighters disarm and later face prosecutions, or if Ankara refuses political concessions, the PKK could fragment rather than disappear. Splinter groups could continue operating from Iraq or Syria, creating a new generation of violence. Turkey has therefore reached the most consequential stage of its peace initiative. The weapons may be leaving the battlefield, but the political bargain has not yet been completed. The vote does not end the conflict. It starts the most delicate phase of the process, because every promise now needs to survive contact with politics on the ground. Turkey is not simply choosing between war and peace. It is gambling that 4 decades of conflict can finally be converted into politics.